So imagine crouching in a muddy, freezing defensive earthwork in eastern Ukraine.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The temperature has dropped well below freezing. The sky above you is buzzing with these lethal drone swarms, and your survival is completely on the line.
Right.
And in that hyper-focused moment of industrialized violence, all the superficial layers of modern life just fall away. You are left with this cold reality of life, death, and duty.
That is a staggering thought.
It really is. Now, ask yourself, how does an ancient letter written to residents of the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia ago guide that soldier's trigger finger today? Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking a deep dive into source material that tackles a subject carrying immense moral weight.
We really are.
And our mission for this analysis is to examine the theology of armed conflict, the precise role of military chaplains, and the Christian conscience in the middle of the Ukraine-Russia war.
Yeah, and we are pulling our insights today from two rigorous, really extensive treatises detailing pastoral care in total war.
Right. And whether you are a theology student dissecting the classics or just someone trying to figure out the ethics of conflict, this analysis is going to unpack the stark moral reality of combat.
These documents are heavily anchored in an exegesis of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, specifically chapter 13, verses 1 through 7.
Oh, yes. Romans 13.
Right. It is a text that has historically been used to justify both immense tyranny and necessary justice, which is why parsing the original context is so crucial.
And just a quick note to you, the listener, before we get into the heavy stuff.
This is key.
These sources tackle the incredibly charged conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Our job today is not to take sides, play politics, or endorse the specific viewpoints, policies, or national claims of either side.
Spot on. We are acting as your guides to unpack the ethical frameworks and theological ideas as the original authors wrote them.
Right. We are impartially reporting the content provided.
Yeah.
So looking at this diagnostic landscape, it is honestly murky.
Extremely murky.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, you get a clean binary. You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor fixes it. But step into the world of armed conflict, and that x-ray machine just shatters.
To grasp how that ancient letter applies to such murky waters, we have to look at the stark reality of what the sources call total war.
Total war. What does the data actually say about that?
Well, by May 2026, United Nations data showed sharply elevated civilian casualties in Ukraine. We are talking about millions of people displaced from their homes, severe attacks on energy infrastructure, and a humanitarian crisis that continues to escalate.
Wow.
Yeah, and the year 2025 was documented as the deadliest for civilians since 2022. The total war means the boundary between the front line and the home front completely dissolves.
So the violence reaches right into civilian homes?
Precisely. It happens through the destruction of the electrical grid, plunging entire cities into freezing darkness during the winter.
The sources paint a picture of a physical and emotional landscape that forces human beings to confront their own mortality every single day.
They do. And the texts point out a massive contrast in how the two nations utilize religious figures in this highly pressurized environment.
Let's look at that. How do they differ?
On one side, the sources depict the Russian Moscow Patriarchate as sacralizing the state's violence.
Astralizing the violence, okay.
Yeah, they have actively expanded their military clergy, bringing in something like 1,500 priests to bolster the aggressive spirit of their forces.
That is a massive number of clergy.
It is. The texts describe this as framing the invasion as a holy war. This approach effectively merges the church and the state apparatus, turning the religious figure into an organ of military morale.
So in that model, the priest acts as a court prophet. The role is to bless the tanks, bless the expansion, and assure the soldiers that heaven mandates their territorial conquest.
That is the dynamic the sources identify, yes. The religion becomes a tool for manufacturing morale and justifying state expansion.
And on the other side?
Conversely, the Ukrainian armed forces took a very different legal route. They established their military chaplaincy legally in 2021 and implemented it fully in 2022.
Okay, so it is a legally defined role.
Right. Under this legal framework, these chaplains are recognized strictly as non-combatants under international humanitarian law.
But the sources bring up a massive logistical hurdle here.
They really do.
The Ukrainian military is facing a severe 45% vacancy rate for these chaplains.
That is a staggering shortage.
It is. That shortage leaves frontline soldiers without spiritual guidance in the most extreme conditions imaginable.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. If a military is facing a massive shortage of personnel and extreme trauma across its ranks, Why not just deploy secular clinical psychologists?
That is a very common question.
Right. I mean, what specific gap does the text argue a chaplain fills that a highly trained clinical therapist cannot?
Well, the sources draw a sharp line between therapeutic coping and a spiritual crisis.
Okay, how so?
Secular psychology offers necessary therapeutic tools. It helps a person cope with stress, process trauma, and manage the psychological friction of combat.
Which is obviously crucial.
Absolutely crucial. But the texts argue that soldiers facing imminent death are dealing with a spiritual crisis before a holy God. They require what the author calls a custody of the soul.
Custody of the soul, that implies a guarding, a protection of something eternal.
Right.
It is not just about bringing a soldier's heart rate down or giving them grounding exercise.
No, not at all. The sources are clear that chaplains must refer severe psychiatric injuries to clinicians.
So they are not trying to replace the doctors.
Correct. If a soldier is dealing with severe depression, psychosis, or acute suicidal danger, that is a medical crisis requiring a medical professional.
Makes sense.
But the chaplain addresses true moral guilt and a person's eternal standing. Medicine cannot resolve moral guilt before the Creator.
That is a really sharp distinction. A therapist can help you feel better about your actions, but a chaplain is there to address whether those actions were right or wrong in the eyes of God.
Precisely. And the independence of the chaplain is crucial to making that work.
The text insists that chaplains must not engage in intelligence gathering, combat, or state propaganda. Their function is purely pastoral.
Right. They aren't there to pass ammunition.
And they aren't there to spy on the troops for the commanding officer either. If a soldier confesses a crisis of conscience, the chaplain has to maintain moral independence from the military apparatus.
Without that independence, the chaplain just becomes another psychological operations tool for the state.
A prop, basically.
Yeah. A true minister of the gospel must maintain the ability to speak truthfully to the soldier, even if that truth does not align with the immediate utilitarian goals of the military command.
Let's shift to the primary biblical anchor of these treatises, because this is where the theology meets the pavement.
Romans 13.
Right. The sources spend a massive amount of time on Romans 13. To understand why Paul's words matter to a soldier today, we need to understand the historical context.
I do.
The Apostle Paul wrote this letter around AD 57 during the early reign of Emperor Nero.
And historians often refer to this early period of his reign as the Quinquennium Neronis.
Okay, what does that mean practically for the people living then?
It was characterized by relative administrative moderation compared to the later years of his rule, but it remained an absolute pagan autocracy.
So it wasn't a democracy.
Not at all. The Roman state was built on military conquest, heavy extraction of taxes, and systemic idolatry.
And the Christian and Jewish communities in Rome were incredibly fragile.
Very fragile, yeah.
They had recently experienced arbitrary imperial force. The sources reference Acts 18.2, noting Emperor Claudius's decree expelling Jews from Rome due to civil disturbances.
Right. They could be kicked out of their homes at a moment's notice.
So you have a congregation living under the shadow of the imperial throne, knowing that at any moment, an edict could come down and strip them of their homes and livelihoods.
And within that fragile community, there was a dangerous undercurrent of zealot-like nationalism and tax resistance bubbling up.
Oh, really? Like a revolutionary mindset?
Yeah. Many early believers assumed that because Jesus was the true king, all earthly authorities were instantly null and void.
I can see how they would reach that conclusion.
Paul wrote to correct this volatile revolutionary spirit.
The structural literary flow of Paul's letter is fascinating. The sources point out that Romans 12 commands believers to reject personal vengeance.
Right. Paul writes, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord.
It commands personal pacifism. You cannot take the law into your own hands. But then Romans 13 immediately shifts to the institution of the state, giving the state the right to bear the sword.
The text argues this is a deliberate, necessary sequence.
How so?
Personal pacifism is commanded, but public institutional justice is executed through the civil magistrate. If you isolate Romans 13 from Romans 12, you get state tyranny. The state becomes a monster with no moral boundaries.
Because it thinks it can do whatever it wants without accountability.
Right. But if you isolate Romans 12 from Romans 13, you get anarchy.
Because if no individual can enact vengeance and there is no state institution to enact justice, then violent criminals just operate with total impunity.
Correct. The sources argue you cannot have one without the other. The state's monopoly on the sword is what allows the individual citizen to put down their own weapon and live peaceably.
That makes a lot of sense. The
Uh,
Greek exegesis in the sources is highly detailed, and we need to walk through it carefully.
Yes, let's look at the Greek.
Let's look at 3 specific terms Paul uses. The first is passa psyche, which translates to every soul.
This means the command to be subject to governing authorities is universal.
No exceptions.
No spiritual elite is exempt. Sometimes religious groups believe their spiritual status gives them a free pass to ignore civil laws. Paul shuts that down entirely.
Every soul includes the apostle, the prophet, the soldier, and the common citizen.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. Yes.
Yeah.
Every single person.
The second term is exousia, which translates to authorities.
Yeah.
Paul uses the plural abstract noun. He points to the structural office of governance.
Right. He is not validating the personal character of a specific despot.
Okay, that is a huge distinction.
He is pointing to the institution itself. The office of the magistrate is ordained by God, even if the man occupying the office is corrupt.
Let me make sure I'm grasping this. It is like saluting the uniform, not the man wearing it.
That is a great analogy.
You might have a commanding officer who is a terrible human being, but you submit to the rank because the structure of the military requires it to function.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The third term reinforces that concept. Paul uses hupotasso, meaning be subject.
Upapas.
The sources note this is a military term for structural alignment. You are falling into your proper rank within a hierarchy.
But the sources make a massive point about what word Paul did not use here.
Yes, the omission is huge.
He deliberately avoided the word pytharchus, which means blind, unquestioning obedience.
That distinction provides a massive theological safeguard.
How does that safeguard work?
It preserves the principle that while citizens must respect the structural office of the magistrate, absolute blind obedience belongs to God alone.
So you structurally align with the state, but you do not turn off your conscience.
Right. You never turn off your conscience.
But think about how radical it must have sounded to the original audience. Paul calls a pagan occupying Roman emperor a deacon of God.
The Greek word is diakonos.
Wait, a deacon? A deacon is usually someone in the church helping with administrative tasks.
Usually, yes.
You are telling me Paul is calling Nero, a guy who eventually burned Christians as human torches, a deacon? How do the sources reconcile calling a pagan ruler a minister of God?
Sounds wild at first.
Does that mean the state's actions are always backed by heaven?
The sources clarify that calling a ruler a diakonos, a servant or deacon, actually demotes the magistrate, even as it dignifies the office.
The demotion.
Yeah, a servant possesses delegated authority, defined work, and strict accountability to a superior.
So by calling the emperor a servant, Paul is quietly pointing out to him that he has a boss.
Yes, a very big boss. The state is a deacon of common grace justice, not a high priest of redemptive grace.
Okay, common grace justice.
The state is there to keep the roads safe, punish thieves, and maintain basic order. It does not mean every action of the state is backed by heaven.
Right, because Paul himself suffered unlawful beating and appealed against injustice utilizing his Roman citizenship.
Exactly. Right. Authority is ordained, but tyranny is not justified by that ordination.
Let's expand on this concept of common grace justice. It means the state's job is restricted to the earthly realm.
Highly restricted.
It is not the state's job to save souls, mandate theology, or act as a proxy for God's eternal wrath. The state is just supposed to keep the chaos at bay.
And that leads directly into how that authority is exercised. The state is granted the authority of the sword to restrain evil and protect the good.
The sources analyze the specific Greek word for sword used by Paul, and this is crucial. The word is machera.
The machera was the short, executive sword used by Roman provincial governors for capital punishment and local defense.
Like a standard-issue weapon for local enforcement?
Right. It was known legally as the ius gladii, the right of the sword. The sources contrast this with another Greek word, rhomphia.
The rhomphia was the massive, double-edged sword of global conquest and apocalyptic judgment.
The distinction is vital. Because the state wields the machera, its force is legally bounded, defensive, and judicial.
So it is not an endorsement of imperialistic crusades or total annihilation.
Not at all. The ruler bears this specific, restricted sword to execute temporal wrath upon the wrongdoer, fulfilling the public justice that was forbidden to individuals in chapter 12.
Let's think about this mechanically. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The machera is like a surgeon's scalpel. A scalpel is highly restricted.
I like that analogy.
A surgeon only cuts what is strictly necessary to save the patient. They remove the tumor to save the surrounding tissue.
Right.
The moment the surgeon starts cutting for revenge or cutting healthy tissue out of malice, it is no longer medicine. It is murder.
That is a stark way to put it, but yes.
And the Ramphea is a wrecking ball. It just levels everything. The sources are arguing that the state's sword operates on the exact same mechanism as the scalpel-restricted defensive necessity.
That surgical analogy captures the exact theological constraint the sources are highlighting. The state is not given a blank check for violence. It is given a specific tool for a specific job.
And Paul grounds submission to the state in the concept of conscience.
The Greek word there is suneidesis.
Okay.
In secular Greco-Roman philosophy, conscience was seen as an autonomous Stoic monitor, a sort of internal voice of reason.
Like your own personal Jiminy Cricket?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right.
But the sources explain that Paul radically redefines this. He frames conscience as a joint knowledge with God.
Joint knowledge, meaning you and God know it together.
Yes. The Christian soldier obeys lawful orders not out of fear of punishment, but as an act of moral duty before God.
So, practically, how does a chaplain advise a soldier when a commander issues an order that seems to cross the line from lawful defense into unlawful action?
That is the hardest question they face.
If blind obedience is idolatry, and the soldier has a joint knowledge with God, what happens when the commanding officer says, shoot those unarmed prisoners?
The sources are unambiguous here. No emergency suspends moral law.
Wow, no emergency at all.
None. When rulers command what God forbids, disobedience is required. The texts cite Acts 5.29. We ought to obey God rather than men.
So the chaplain has to step in there.
The chaplain must teach soldiers to seek clarification, use reporting channels, and refuse participation in manifestly unlawful acts.
Even if that refusal carries a severe penalty like a court-martial or a firing squad.
Yes. The sources acknowledge that faithful refusal might be very costly. But the conscience is bound to the creator, not the commander.
You cannot invoke, I was following orders, to justify deliberate attacks on civilians, torture, or the execution of prisoners.
You cannot. The Nuremberg trials establish this in secular international law, but the texts argue it has always been a theological mandate.
This brings us to a heavy portion of the sources, which is the discussion on moral injury.
That is a tough subject.
Moral injury happens when individuals perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness acts that violate their core moral convictions.
The texts argue there is a clear moral asymmetry in the current conflict.
How so?
Ukraine's defense has a just cause that Russia's territorial aggression lacks. A war of territorial aggression cannot be placed on the same moral plane as the defense of a nation's people and sovereignty.
However, the sources firmly state that just cause does not grant tribal innocence.
That is a critical distinction to maintain.
Right, because having the right to defend your home does not mean every action you take in that defense is automatically pure.
United Nations reports cited in the text document widespread violations by Russian forces, yes.
But they also mention the other side.
They do. They record mistreatment committed by Ukrainian personnel, especially during the capture and transit of prisoners. The Christian ethic refuses both false equivalence and tribal innocence.
So the chaplain has to address the reality of guilt with incredible precision.
They do.
If a soldier is acting as that scalpel for the state, what happens when the scalpel slips? Or when the soldier is forced into a situation where every option involves terrible violence?
The texts differentiate between two types of guilt that the chaplain must manage.
Let's break those down.
Yes. The distinction between false guilt and true guilt is paramount.
What is false guilt?
False guilt is the feeling of being polluted by proximity to death, despite doing your lawful duty.
Okay, give me an example of that.
A soldier who legally neutralizes an enemy combatant in a firefight to save his unit might feel intensely guilty. He feels the massive weight of having taken a human life.
But the sources argue that, theologically, he hasn't committed a sin.
Correct. He executed the lawful duty of the Mashera.
So he did his job.
Right. False guilt requires truth and correction. The chaplain must help the soldier realize they acted within the bounds of moral law.
Okay, and what about true guilt?
True guilt, on the other hand, involves actual sins committed. If a soldier executes a surrendered prisoner out of rage, that is true guilt.
And a secular therapist might just try to help the soldier manage the PTSD symptoms from that event?
Right. They might focus on the trauma.
But the chaplain has to confront the moral reality of the murder.
True guilt requires confession and repentance. The chaplain cannot offer cheap grace.
They have to do the hard work.
They have to walk the soldier through the difficult process of acknowledging the sin before God and seeking actual forgiveness, which is a fundamentally different process than psychological coping.
The sources also demand humanity toward the enemy, what they call enemy love in practice.
Yes.
This means refusing ethnic slurs, halting the social media celebration of death, and ensuring Russian prisoners receive medical care and food without propaganda.
It requires refusing to deny the humanity of the aggressor, even while using lawful force to stop them.
Let me bring the reality of the text to your ear for a moment, listener.
It is a harsh reality.
It is one thing for us to sit here in a calm studio analyzing texts and talking about enemy love. It is another reality entirely in a freezing trench in the Donbas.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, isn't enemy love in a trench just a quick way to get your unit killed? How do the sources justify this practically when soldiers are losing their friends daily to drone strikes?
It requires an enormous reliance on the theological realities we have discussed. The chaplain must form the conscience before the crisis hits.
So it is about preparation.
Training should occur, using realistic scenarios. The chaplain must point beyond the immediate terror to the sovereign God who will execute perfect justice.
Okay.
Enemy love does not require surrender to aggression. It requires acting as an accountable agent of the state's restrained sword, rather than an agent of personal vengeance.
So loving the enemy doesn't mean dropping your weapon and letting them kill you.
No, not at all.
It means pulling the trigger without malice in your heart, strictly out of defensive necessity, and then treating them with human dignity if they are wounded and captured.
That is the exact tension the texts describe. It is an incredibly difficult line to walk, which is why the sources insist a well-formed conscience is so vital.
And that leads us to the Christological fulfillment of these concepts. How does the life of Jesus factor into the actions of the state?
The texts point to Christ's trial before Pontius Pilate and his eventual return.
Let's look at that trial.
Christ submitted to Pilate's delegated authority. He is standing in front of a corrupt middle management Roman bureaucrat who is about to condemn him unjustly.
Right.
Yet Jesus tells Pilate, "Thou couldst have no authority at all against me, except it were given thee from above."
Jesus recognized the structural authority of the Roman governor while suffering its corrupt execution.
He did.
He didn't deny that Pilate held the office. He didn't incite a rebellion to overthrow Rome right then and there. He acknowledged the office was delegated by heaven even as it was being abused.
The text contrasts Christ's first advent, where he submitted to the Mashera, with his second coming.
And what does the second coming look like in this context?
The book of Revelation depicts him returning with the Ramphia, that large sword of global judgment, to execute perfect physical justice.
The sources reject postmillennialism and the social gospel, asserting that earthly governments cannot create a utopia.
Earthly magistrates and military forces are imperfect tools.
They are just temporary.
Right. They are designed to restrain evil until absolute righteous rule is established upon the earth. They cannot fix the human heart or create a perfect society.
So we have covered a massive theological framework dealing with Greek words, the Roman Empire, and the brutal realities of modern warfare.
We covered a lot of ground.
But let's bring it back to you, the listener. You might not be a soldier or a military chaplain, but you deal with authority every single day.
We all do.
How does understanding civil authority as a temporary borrowed stewardship change the way an everyday person views their local government, their civic duties, and their tax payments? Paul explicitly mentions paying taxes to these officials.
If authority is a borrowed stewardship, then the citizen owes government what belongs to its office, not what belongs to God.
So you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Right. You pay taxes because officials are public officials attending to administration. You respect the office.
But you don't worship it.
No, you do not offer the state an undivided religious loyalty. This distinction allows a person to participate in civic life, pay their dues, and respect laws without confessing that the nation is sinless or eternal.
It frees you from expecting the government to be your savior, and it frees you from total despair when the government fails because you know it is just a temporary placeholder anyway.
It creates a healthy, realistic civic engagement grounded in a higher accountability.
Let's synthesize the core takeaways from these treatises. The state is an accountable institution established to restrain evil. The sword is meant to be a restrained tool of justice, not a weapon of hatred.
Yes.
And true obedience involves the conscience, keeping moral responsibility firmly intact, regardless of the chain of command.
And I would encourage you, the listener, to consider how you manage your own conscience in your daily life.
That is a great question.
When you interact with authority, whether it is a police officer, a tax auditor, or a local city council, are you acting out of fear of punishment or out of a settled moral conviction? Or your actions governed by a joint knowledge with your Creator?
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, looking at the ancient text of Romans 13 and its application to the most brutal realities of modern conflict.
We certainly have.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, building on the sources, but looking forward.
What of that?
If the text heavily relies on the human conscience, the syneidesis, to judge the lawful use of the sword, what happens when nations fully hand the machira over to artificial intelligence and autonomous drone swarms? If a machine holds the sword, making life or death targeting decisions without human input, where does the moral conscience reside? Who is morally guilty when the autonomous scalpel slips? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking.